Welcome to the NT podcast. I'm Nemanja Jurisic. Today's episode takes us into one of the most complex, disturbing, and theologically rich books of the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Ezekiel. To help us navigate these difficult waters, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Daniel Block, one of the world's leading scholars on Ezekiel and professor of Old Testament. In fact, many scholars would say that he is the number one in this field. So, Dr. Block, welcome.
It's a joy to be with you again. Yes, thank you.
Yes, this is the second time, so I appreciate your time very much. Let me just read a quick biography. Dr. Block earned his DPhil at University of Liverpool, School of Archaeology and Oriental Studies. He is Gunther H. Knoedler, Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Wheaton College, and he has worked as a senior translator on the New Living Translation, NLT. Revised edition with particular responsibility for the books of Moses. So, Professor Block, anything to add about this fascinating biography? And by the way, happy holidays! Yeah.
Yes. Well, happy holidays to you too. All I can say is that I'm just a farm boy from northern Saskatchewan. No, number 9 of 15 children. We were very poor growing up. And the Lord has just led us to the far corners of the world, on mission for Him. And so it's a joy to be with you.
Thank you so much. So let's open our investigation with this. Who is Ezekiel? At the beginning, what we know about this individual? Can you give us some more information? Yeah.
Well, all we know about the man is what we get from the book. He is not mentioned anywhere else. The name Ezekiel and related names are found elsewhere, but they're of different people. From the opening of the book, we learn that he was the call to priestly ministry came to him when he was 30 years old. Had he been in Jerusalem, it would have been the moment of his ordination, we could say, but he is in exile in Babylon. He was schlepped off to Babylon in 598, along with Jehoiakim and 10,000 other captives from Judah, from the upper classes. He is among the exiles there, and he is there because he was part of the problem. Along with the rest, this is God's judgment upon the people, the first phase of it, and he is dragged off into exile. And when the call comes to him, Ezekiel is very resistant to the call, and that, I think, accounts for the first 3 chapters of the book, where you have the Lord breaking down his resistance with a whole series of steps. Of course, the most impressive of which is, and most puzzling, is the vision he sees of God at that point. But Ezekiel is a priest. We tend to view him as, first and foremost, this is his call to prophetic ministry. But I would prefer to say that the function he fulfills is that of priest. The adjective after this is a prophetic priest. And so he is hereby ordained for service on behalf of the Lord, and his audience will be his fellow exiles in Babylon.
Very good. So you said that he's not mentioned anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. I think also not in New Testament. So as a Christian, can you say how to connect Christianity, Jesus, with Ezekiel? Did Jesus maybe read Ezekiel, or apostles? I don't know.
Well, I'm sure they did. I mean, there are lots of allusions to Ezekiel, especially in the book of Revelation. But other than that, relatively few. And how to account for that? probably because he was so focused on a particular moment in history, and his message was concerned with that audience, their own hardened hearts, and seeking to draw them back to the Lord. The key issue in the book is, and you hear it several times, when these things have happened, you will know that a prophet has been in their midst, and he is talking about the fall of Jerusalem. He is the prophet in advance telling the exiles, you're not going home anytime soon. Jerusalem must fall first. And when that happens, then you'll know a true prophet has been there. So he is a very parochial prophet in that sense. Though when he starts the nations as a whole function in this book primarily as witnesses to what God will do. Then the nations will know that I am Yahweh, and as God's agents of judgment for Jerusalem and Judah at the time, particularly Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Other than that, the vision, even into the distant future, is preoccupied with Israel's own restoration rather than cosmic restoration or international coming to Yahweh. It's quite unlike Isaiah when you get to the end of the book of Isaiah, where the world is his audience and he sees God working cosmically more than Ezekiel does.
Beautiful. So let's touch also his psychology, because many scholars would almost agree that he was something like mentally ill or crazy, or I don't know. Even if I read the book, I get sense that he's sometimes angry and I don't know, he changes his emotions. But you touched this insightfully in your commentary, so can you tell us?
Well, I had a professor when I was in graduate school who called him the nut of the Old Testament. He does act crazily, and psychiatrists and psychologists have done all kinds of psychological testing on him, and they have established in their minds, at least, that he meets the qualifications of manic depressive, a narcissist, and all sorts of others. He is preoccupied with issues of blood and feces, and he performs all these strange and lunatic kinds of actions, lying naked in, outside his house, I imagine, in chapter 4. So they have largely dismissed him as a man who is possessed, and not necessarily in a positive way. The other side of this is, though, that of all the prophets, Ezekiel is most, shall we say, persistently and consistently theocentric in his perspective. He looks at the world from God's viewpoint rather than from the human viewpoint. And for that reason, those of us in the Protestant tradition, we recognize that Ezekiel is one of the most, shall we say, Calvinist of all the prophets. I was teaching a course on this for Doctor of Ministry students, and my older brother was my student. And at the end of the week, they were he and his wife were at our house for supper. And he said, "But Dan, you're such a Calvinist." And I said, "Really? Our roots are Mennonite, and they're not known to be Calvinistic." And he certainly was not. And I said, "Well, when I'm reading the book of Ezekiel, that's the perspective I have to get. That's where Ezekiel is. God is in absolute control of everything. though there is also absolute freedom for people to do, if they are judged, it's always on themselves and not on God. Chapter 18 is very clear. And so my response to my brother was, if that doesn't make me a Calvinist, it just makes Calvin biblical. And so I want to be biblical and go where the text leads me. When I read Jeremiah, his counterpart, his countryman at the same time, contemporary, Jeremiah's there's a strong theocentric view as well, but on the other hand, he feels much more in touch with the world and he responds personally. Ezekiel is almost like a robot. God is pulling the strings, telling him what to do, and he lets God do that to him. Once he gets going, once his will has been broken and he says, all right, I will do what you ask me to do, he does it then unquestioningly for the most part. Sometimes he asks, but his tone is never bitter at that point. But when God asks him to eat food cooked over human dung, he says, oh, really? You really want me to do that? Nothing unclean has ever passed through my gullet. And then God concedes and says, okay, we'll make it cow dung instead, or sheep dung. And there are a couple of times where Ezekiel does respond this way. But on the other hand, it is for clarification. And once he gets going, in the opening chapters, I find him to be very resistant, so I can identify with him in my own earlier resistance to what God was trying to do in my life. I can identify with him. But once he gets going against all odds, everything goes against him, but he continues. The word of the Lord came to me saying, and what you have in the book is not what Ezekiel told the people. It's what God told him. So these are virtual transcripts of revelation to him. Whether he passed them on verbally exactly as they came to him is another question. But in any case, he has transcribed the words that came to him from God for the most part, and that's the book.
So can we say that this person wants to show us that God can use even some people that go nuts? So is this a message of the book or not? Am I missing?
Yes, let me come back to that. I actually think that he isn't nuts. Ezekiel is, in fact, a man under the control of the whole of the Spirit of God, so that accounts for his prophetic passion, his prophetic strategies, and all the rest of it. This is not a sign of some psychiatric problem. This is the sign of a man filled with a mind and the passion of God. And I think that's the way we need to be ourselves. in our service.
Sorry about, I didn't understand well. Yeah, I get it now. So let's talk about his book. So we have Ezekiel and the Book of Ezekiel. Are those connected? Is he author or somebody else? And when would you date this book? So can you tell us?
Well, there's always the larger question of how prophetic books were produced. And it's actually a long process, and it's not that simple. So that let's just trace the steps in the production of a prophetic book. Stage 1, the Lord calls a prophet. Stage 2, the Lord reveals a message to the prophet. Stage 3, the prophet presents that message to the Lord's intended audience. Stage, was that 3? 4, somebody transcribes the document, the message. Now, in some instance, people have argued that what you have here is the written copy before he proclaimed. Some would say, well, this is a transcription after the fact. It's not always clear. Somebody then gathers these, well, maybe even before that, somebody in Ezekiel, you have a very distinctive feature. A half a dozen, or is it 8 or 10 times, you have what we call is a date notice at the top. Now, in year X, month Y, and day Z or Z, the word of the Lord came to me. That's not part of the prophet, a prophecy. That's a narrator's introduction to it. So at some stage, that was added to the document of the individual prophecies. Then they were gathered and arranged and put into a complete book. And then I think the last stage is somebody added the beginning of the book, which in most prophetic books involves a statement of the persons, the identity of the prophet, the kings who reigned during that prophet's ministry. That's probably the last editorial phase. Now, where was Ezekiel involved in this business? I think we have to look at every prophetic book differently. Jeremiah had a friend, Baruch, who was his scribe. And we know that Baruch wrote down Jeremiah's, some of Jeremiah's prophecies. There was also at the end of the book, you have a Sariah shows up, and he goes to Babylon with some of Jeremiah's prophets in his briefcase, prophecies in his briefcase. He takes them to Babylon. In the case of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has no friends except his wife, of course. But at a critical moment in chapter 24, the Lord takes his wife and he's left all by himself. He has no friends. There isn't a hint of anybody in the book responding positively to his message. Not one. But I think this helps to explain, in my own view, is that Ezekiel himself is a priest, and he is very interested in preserving order and system, in seeing that order and system in the world. And in this book, you have a very organized book. What's different from this book from Jeremiah? In Jeremiah, whoever put that book together says repeatedly, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah saying. So that whoever's writing that is somebody other than Jeremiah, third person. In Ezekiel, it is always first person. The word of the Lord came to me saying. So that certainly creates the impression that what we have here is the prophet's own collections of oracles, in my view, that he probably wrote down close to the time of the prophetic experience with respect to the opening vision, which is a private vision for himself. He must have written that one down very quickly because the grammar, the syntax, the Hebrew, the vocabulary, the broken sentences, he jumps back and forth. He's looking for vocabulary to describe what he has seen. He's in an excited state of mind as he writes this. I wish I knew what I was saying here. So he talks about the appearance of the form of the glory of the Lord, whatever else. He's looking for vocabulary. When that vision comes back in chapter 10, which is now, I think, 15 months later, he has all the vocabulary he needs, and it has none of those grammatical and syntactical problems. It's all organized. So in my view, this is the one book that if there is the prophet himself involved in the composition of the book, this is the one. The exception would be the first verses in the book. It opens enigmatically. Now, it happened in the 30th year. And he doesn't tell us 30th year of what. Everywhere else, the date notices are based on Jehoiakim's exile and his own exile. This one is the 30th year. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, I was by the river Kibar. I was, notice, first person, but then in verses 2 and 3, there's a parenthetical comment. On the 5th of the month, in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river, and there the hand of the Lord came upon him. Third person. So it strikes me that somebody, after the fact, recognized this is a riddle. We've got to fill in the blanks. 30th year of what? And who is this person? And I think this gives us a clue about the date and all the rest of that. So that was probably another hand.
Yes, it makes sense. So thank you again. And can you just tell us the exact year? What is the earliest and the latest possible dating for this book? Can you tell us your opinion?
Well, the latest the earliest possible date would be well, he is called in the 5th year. I was going to look at the actual table. I have it. I haven't got it all memorized. The earliest possible date, well, the date of his call is July 31, 593. Thanks to these date notices and thanks to what archaeologists have found and published of the records with Ezekiel's dates, we can almost give or take 1 or 2 days, we can date all of these quite precisely. So he was called on 593. I imagine he may have written down what he saw there within weeks or months. He's still in an excited state. So that's the earliest possible date of anything being written down. But the latest possible date comes in chapter 29, 17, where he has his last prophecy, 29:17, is in 571 BC. Remarkably, this is not the last chapters. The last chapters happen, they are revealed. No, that wasn't right. That was 570. Yes. 573. That was the date of the last 8 chapters. Chapter 40, verse 1, he's got a date notice. In the 25th year, on the 1st month, on the 10th day of the month. But the one about Egypt in chapter 29, 17 to 21, that one happened in the 27th year on the 1st day of the 1st month, New Year's Day. So now we don't know when Ezekiel died, but by the time that last oracle in 571, 593 to 71, that's 22 years. There's still no hint of any response to his preaching. Not a hint. In fact, there's no hint anywhere that anybody responded, except When Cyrus issues the decree that people can go home and rebuild Jerusalem in 539, thousands went back. From where did they come? They were exiles in Judah. So that suggests that there was a new generation arose that got it. And a revival must have broken out, and they repented of their sins, and then in God's good time, under Cyrus's sponsorship, actually, they went back to Jerusalem and started rebuilding the temple. They were not perfect people. We find that out very quickly in Ezra and Nehemiah. But in any case, that gives us some context. Moshe Greenberg, the foremost Jewish Ezekiel scholar, argues that there are very few elements in this book. He got as far as chapter 37 in his commentary before he passed away. But there are very few elements in this book that do not come from the hand of Ezekiel. And so in this instance, I think one could argue that the prophet who speaks and the prophet who produced the book are the same. With respect to Isaiah and Hosea and these other people, they're actually anonymous books. We know who the preacher was, but we don't know who collected these oracles and put them together.
Yes, amazing. Thank you again, Professor Block. Now I'm really interested in this topic. How much amount or percent of Torah is Ezekiel aware of? Because does the Torah exist even in his time? We talked in a previous episode about Deuteronomy, and you explained that he at least know Deuteronomy. So does he know Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers?
Well, I think the question is, does he know them is one question. Does he make much use of them is another. I think, if I remember right, Abraham is mentioned only once or twice in the book. There are not many allusions to Genesis in this book. You do have one in chapter 21 where there's an allusion to Genesis 49, and he shall come to whom the judgment belongs. It's an oracle about Nebuchadnezzar, to whom God is giving judgment. But there are echoes of Genesis 49:10, the Jacob's blessing of Judah, which I think the people are using that as a base of security, and Ezekiel turns it on its head, and he says, no, the one to whom the judgment belongs is not a messianic figure. And it's judgment in the different sense of the word. It is Nebuchadnezzar. So yeah, he's undoubtedly aware of these. Early on, in my work, there was a scholar from Israel who presented a paper at the Society of Biblical Literature in which he argued that Ezekiel, there's nothing Deuteronomic in Ezekiel. He is very priestly in orientation. He is linked to the holiness code. That's what I prefer, instructions on holiness in Leviticus. He's obviously connected there. But then, of course, the question becomes the direction of influence. Is the P document in the Pentateuch inspired by Ezekiel, or is Ezekiel inspired by what people identify as the P document? Michael Lyons has done a good work on that one, and he argues there's no doubt that Ezekiel knows that which scholars identify as P. Well, early on, I had a student who came to me, a doctoral student who came to me having studied under Michael Fox at the University of Madison, who is an Ezekiel scholar. And as a master's student, he worked through Ezekiel with him. And he came to study with me, and I was working on Deuteronomy at the time. And I challenged him to prove this scholar from Israel wrong, the guy who said there is nothing Deuteronomic in Ezekiel, and he produced a very fine dissertation. Jason Guile is his name, and it's well worth reading, and it's a very convincing piece. There is lots that's Deuteronomic in this book. He argues, for instance, that chapter 16, the longest chapter in the book, and it's a very disturbing chapter. God marries Jerusalem. He finds this foundling out there and rescues her and marries her and makes her his queen. It's all metaphorical language, of course. Jerusalem is his bride. And then she goes off the rails and becomes wicked and all the rest of that. And he discovered that whole rewriting of Israel's history finds its template in Deuteronomy 32. So, yes, I am convinced that Ezekiel had the whole Pentateuch before available to him, whether it was in a continuous single scroll or separate scrolls is another question. But there's no doubt in my mind that the entire Pentateuch antedates all of the prophets, including Hosea and Amos. That's my view. Yes, excellent. In fact, yeah. When the judgment comes, it's very clear that Ezekiel tells the story or predicts the judgment of Judah in terms found in Deuteronomy 28, the curses there, and in terms of Leviticus 26. So you've got the P-ish kind of document, and you've got the Deuteronomy. There's no doubt in my mind that he is well aware of that. And then when the story of Israel's restoration is given in chapters 34, it's a great shepherd chapter. The Lord deposes all the shepherds of Israel. He shepherds them, brings them back. And then at the end, he gives us a picture of the covenant of peace that he will, Brit Shalom, that he will make with the people. And what follows there, the vocabulary is taken straight out of Leviticus 26. And so there's no doubt in my mind that Ezekiel, as a priest, he will have been thoroughly familiar with the Torah, because it is their job to teach Torah in Israel. And regardless of their spiritual condition, he will have grown up learning Torah.
Excellent. So at least Torah antedates Ezekiel, that's 6th century BC. So yes. Those theories about Persian period, that's maybe too much. Yes. So yes. Can you tell us more about themes from the Genesis? We have mentioning Noah. We have, I think, the theme of Eden, right? So yes. Is he aware of all this in Genesis?
The short answer is, and my naive answer is, yes. I mean, there are, when we come to chapter 14, where he says, even if Noah or Job or Daniel were in their midst, he's aware of what's going on. He's aware of the traditions. And I think it's not just an oral tradition at this point. I think he's had access to written versions of course, Daniel, that is a problem in scholarly world these days. Daniel is his contemporary. My own interpretation, my own understanding of Daniel is that he was an historical character whom Nebuchadnezzar brought to Babylon in, was it 604 BC? The first time Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, he took a handful of hostages with him. And Daniel and his three friends were taken to Babylon at that time. I compare Daniel's role in the exile of the Judeans to Babylon to be the equivalent of Joseph in the Genesis story. So that as Joseph tells his brothers, you guys sold me, but God sent me to preserve life. And so it was God's way of preparing Egypt to receive the Israelites who were coming. In my view, Daniel was God's agent that he sent to Babylon, and miraculously he rose to the highest court of the country, serving as Nebuchadnezzar's advisor. But my sense is, and we don't have particular evidence of this, but although the Judeans came to Babylon as captives, they had been humiliated and dragged off. They didn't want to go, of course. They were dragged off against their will. Once they got to Babylon, somebody settled them in places where they could flourish. There is no hint in Ezekiel that they are slaves. And extra biblical writings also confirm that very quickly the Judeans rose in the economic circles, and their names start showing up in all kinds of business and banking transactions. So that when in 539, Cyrus says, anybody who wants to go back to Jerusalem, you can go. Yes, it was thousands, and I've forgotten what it is, 43,000 in Ezra, something like that. But most of them stayed in Babylon. They didn't go home. They were doing quite well, thank you. They were not slaves wishing they could be delivered. But they had flourished there, and when the time came, there were those that were ready to go. So in my naive perspective, this is how I reconstruct the timeline, the historical events. So that in chapter 14, if he mentions Daniel along with Job and Abraham, he's thinking of his contemporary who has already established himself as a righteous figure who embodies godliness. But he's been removed from Jerusalem, and even if you were back there, of course, it is complicated by the fact that in extra biblical texts, specifically Ugaritic texts from the late Bronze Age, about 1200 BC, the name Daniel has showed up as a man who is a significant figure. Daniel. And so it's widely accepted that in that case, in chapter 14, Abraham and Job are legendary figures from Israel's tradition. But he's also aware of this Canaanite Daniel as a noble man. And so I went back and forth on my own interpretation of that. I think by the time I landed where I did, I had changed my mind 3 or 4 times. But I am convinced that he is, in fact, thinking about his own contemporary in Babylon city. Then he's at Nippur, which is to the southeast of Babylon. Ezekiel is. But no, I think Daniel is Ezekiel is aware both of the ancient traditions, biblical traditions, and aware also of what's happening in the court of Babylon.
Thank you, Dr. Block. But Dr. Collins would say that if we have Noah, he's from old, and also
Yeah.
Job, he's unknown and also from old times.
Yeah.
It makes sense to say that Daniel, that's a Ugaritic one because he's from old. Daniel is contemporary prophet. So how would you answer that? Critique.
Well, of course, that is a natural way to go. I've forgotten what is the order in which they appear in the text.
I can read. If even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, Daniel is the second.
Yeah, he's in the middle. He's sandwiched between the two. He's not giving us a chronological sequence here. I think what he is doing is, even if one of our old heroes and one non-Israelite righteous man from the past, they're the two slices of bread, and then Daniel is the meat in the middle, the cheese. There are other ways of looking at that. He is not by definition thinking only of ancient heroes. He may, of course, the word of the Lord came to me. God knows what's going on, so he knows Daniel. But it has to make sense to the Judean exiles. And I think this is a part of his rhetoric. You exiles, you should be aware of that guy in Babylon, in the city of Babylon right now. Even if he were in Jerusalem today, his presence would not spare the fury of God. Collins, and that's the common one. These are all legendary figures, and Daniel isn't. He became a legendary figure, but at the time of Ezekiel's prophecies, that was not the case. But in the minds of the exiles, I think the Lord is deliberately linking this oracle in chapter 14 with a person they are aware of. And they know him to be a righteous person, even if he were back there at the time of the judgment's coming. He couldn't hold off my hand of judgment.
Yes, fascinating. I never heard this argument. It makes sense to me. But we have another reference in Ezekiel 28. So he says, "You are indeed wiser than Daniel." So does that
right.
make that? Does it help about our conclusion?
Yes, well, of course, if you look at the role of Daniel in the book of Daniel, he is a wise man in the court of the king. And he is wise beyond human wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that he has the spirit of the gods. That's his language. So that the character that is painted in the book of Daniel fits what we need to have here. Even if the guy who's in the court of Nebuchadnezzar today were in Jerusalem, I think that's true. But you asked before about Eden and things like that. That takes us back to other traditions, like the Genesis tradition of paradise in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. And of course, the name Daniel shows up in the first half of Ezekiel 28. There are two oracles. One is to the king of Tyre, and the other one, the prince of Tyre. He changes the vocabulary here. But in the second half of that one, he's got this magnificent portrait of the king of Tyre, who is God's signet in Eden, and he goes off the rails. He is there as God's agent of supervision and all, and its well-being. There's no doubt in my mind that this chapter 28, I don't think it's Satan. I don't think it's Satan any more than in Isaiah 14, you have Lucifer, star of the morning, whatever else. These words are picked up in Revelation and elsewhere of the demonic figure. But I think what he is doing there, he is presenting the king of Tyre as somebody who has been planted by God in Eden to be the governor of that place. And it has gone to his head. He knows he is glorious, and in the end, he falls. Great is the fall of those who rise the highest. And here is one who said in the first half, I am God, and I dwell in the seat of God. Well, that's not even, that wouldn't have been acceptable even in Tyre. In Egypt, the kings knew they were gods. Alexander claimed to be God when he was in Egypt, and the Roman emperors would claim the titles. But in the ancient world, outside of Egypt, this was not common. So here is a person, the king of Tyre. I think he represents Tyre, the city, which has been resisting God's use of Nebuchadnezzar as his agent. And that's why Tyre and Egypt become the subjects of specific and harsh judgments. But here's this king who is seated on his throne in the midst of the seas. He thinks he's the governor of the whole world, and all the world revolves around him. But the image is a combination of Genesis kind of, God put Adam in the Garden of Eden to be the administrator for him. And he betrayed his calling. This person did as well. But there are other elements in that chapter that they echo some Babylonian texts where you have reference to gardens and gemstones and all the rest of that, and amazing fruitful environment. There are echoes of extra biblical things. This is the interesting thing. When Daniel is working with the foreign nations, the shape of the message is determined to a large extent by foreign perceptions. And that's what's happening here. It's not these oracles are not intended for the king of Tyre. They're intended for the Judean exiles, but he paints them with his local coloring that gives them authenticity and integrity and enhances the rhetoric as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Block. That was exactly my next question, but you already covered. So, yeah, we need to be fair. Maybe, is it fair to say that New Testament authors and apostles think like, oh, this is evil characteristic, so we can use from this king of Tyre and describe Satan in our experience and way? And is it fair to say it like that, or?
Well, I would rather do it another way. I would rather see the king of Tyre here as humanity in its hubris, where man becomes the measure of all things, and he owns the world because he is important, successful, good, God. And especially since it's not addressed to the Tyrians, to the town of Tyre, it's addressed to the king. He embodies rulers that become tyrants. And instead of being there as agents commissioned by God to govern his people and his world, they think everything revolves around them, and this tyrant has to be deposed. And so we have enough illustrations of rulers even in our day who behave that way as if they're the measure of all things. And I think that, of course, that is true in the New Testament. When you get to the New Testament, it's true of Hasatan, who becomes this figure who thinks he can control the world as well. And so it can be adapted in new ways, but the new ways of adapting it do not determine the original meaning. We read the Bible forwards before we read it backwards. So
Great lesson. Yeah, thank you so much for this clarification. And now let's get back 2 chapters earlier about prophecy about destruction of Tyre. So, do we have actually failed prophecy? Because we see that even text reveals that this is not quite fulfilled in a full sense, because it said not even a stone will remain from this city. But we have, yeah. Can you explain this?
well, I'm glad you asked this question because it gives me a chance to tell your audience that whatever I have written in my commentary on chapter 27, verses 17 to 21, they need to tear that out of the commentary. I have changed my mind completely. This text, I mean, when I was working on the commentary, I was least satisfied with what I had done here. And in that commentary, I had Ezekiel struggling over the fact that God wasn't keeping his word. Well, there is some of that in there, but that's not the point. The point of the text, and I have actually published an essay on that, completely reworking it, and I can give you the bibliography of that later if you want, and you can include it in whatever you do here. It's
Yes, please.
important. Yes, I will do that. And it will be represented in my new commentary that's coming out within a year, I hope, on the whole book of Ezekiel in a one-volume commentary. So my new perspective will be represented there. This is an amazing chapter, or an amazing oracle. It's a very short one, and it's his last one. This is the last we hear of Ezekiel, the last words out of his mouth, or out of the Lord's mouth to Ezekiel. And the curious thing about this whole text, it's not about failed prophecy. It's about Nebuchadnezzar, his agent, and Ezekiel, his agent. And he talks about how Nebuchadnezzar has worked so hard to get Tyre. Every shoulder is rubbed bare and every head is bald because they've been carrying buckets of dirt to produce the siege works and everything else. They've worked really hard. And then our translations, almost all of them say something, but he and his army had no wages from Tyre for the labor they performed. That's not actually what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew doesn't say he has no labor. It says he's not been adequately compensated for his efforts. He's had a lot of gain from that enterprise. He owns all the territory up and down on the mainland. He hasn't conquered the island, but the island has become his vassal state. And we know that from extra biblical texts, which refer to a king of Babylon, of Tyre, who is in Babylon in exile, just like Daniel and Jehoiakim are. So he didn't get nothing. But here the Lord is saying, I've got to do right by my servant. And so he promises him Egypt, which creates other historical issues. At what point did he actually get Egypt? But the point here is, God is, even though Nebuchadnezzar was an awful man, he was God's agent. And anybody who tried to stop him from doing God's work was punished. Nebuchadnezzar would be rewarded for being his agent. But of course, there are two sides to this one. Jeremiah has a long oracle of judgment on Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel has only a slight hint at the end of chapter 21, where there's a slight hint of the sword is to go back into its sheath and the Lord will judge him there. But in this case, it is about God keeping his contract with his agent. And then it ends, oh, by the way, on that day, I will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel, and I will open your mouth in their midst, then they will know that I am the Lord. What's that got to do with anything? Ezekiel is his other agent. And Ezekiel lives in a world where nobody's listening to him. But now God says, and this is an amazing, I will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel. That expression becomes messianic. And so that Jehoiakim is in Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. There's an allusion to the restoration of the Davidic monarchy here to Ezekiel. And I will open your mouth in their midst, then they will know that I am Yahweh. What does that mean? Well, it means that they will finally recognize Ezekiel as a true prophet. They've rejected him throughout his ministry, but the day is coming. Ezekiel, you will have your reward. The people will remember you as a true prophet. And of course, the New Testament doesn't name him. Nobody else in the First Testament names him, but we name him. We're talking about him. Why are we having this podcast here? The Lord is faithful to Ezekiel, so that Nebuchadnezzar's fate would be one, on the one hand, he would be rewarded in his lifetime for the work he did on God's behalf in bringing down Judah for their sins. He would be rewarded for that. But on the other hand, in the end, he will be accountable for all the madness that he perpetrated as well. So, and of course, this raises lots of theological questions. How can God use an agent who is not qualified to be his agent and then hold him accountable for his atrocities at the end? It's not easily resolved. It is a theological issue. But it is the same issue that you have, for instance, in the Great Deluge, in the Big Flood. God uses nature to destroy his people. Well, does that make nature bad? And that's, so the whole world is in convulsions at that point. Here it's using a human agent, but that does not excuse that human agent for misbehavior. And so it's Nebuchadnezzar, even from the book of Daniel, he is a king of Tyre kind of figure. He's very arrogant, and there's no excuse for that. So anyhow, but I'll get you the documentation on that rewritten work. I can send you a copy of it, in fact.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. This is completely new for me, so
Yes.
amazing. I can't wait to read. So, what about other prophecies? You mentioned the restoration of Davidic monarchy. We
Yes.
have Ezekiel 40 to 48. It describes temple and Levites and many things. So it seems that we expect something like Davidic monarchy, but we don't get it. So is it too much to say, oh, that's New Testament period, actually heavenly kingdom, or it's maybe New Testament idea? So what do you think?
Well, I'm glad you raised that question, and we actually can't answer it without talking first about what has been Ezekiel's strategy, or the Lord's strategy for Ezekiel. It's very theocentric here. The Lord's strategy for Ezekiel in the shape of his prophecies. And there's a close link between what happens in the first judgment period up to chapter 24 for Israel, and then the judgment of the nations, and the restoration. And in my commentary, I highlight the fact that the real problem with the Judeans was a theological problem. They had this doctrine of what I call eternal security. Every promise in the book is mine, mine, mine. Yahweh is mine. We are eternally secure. This is what the people in Jerusalem are saying. And this is what the people in exile are saying. Jerusalem will never fall. God is obligated to keep it. And there are four grounds. I call these the four pillars of the Judeans' doctrine of security. One, God has made a covenant with his people that's eternal, for which there is no divorce. I will be yours forever, ad olam. Second, God has promised the land of Canaan as their homeland, ad olam. And as the angel of the Lord says, the Malach Yahweh in Judges chapter 2, God never breaks a covenant promise. Third, I have chosen Jerusalem as my dwelling place forever, ad olam. And fourth, I have given David and his descendants eternal title to the land of Israel. These are the four props that the Judeans are claiming as their base of security. God cannot let Nebuchadnezzar enter the city. And the closer Nebuchadnezzar's armies come, the more people hang on to the promises of God. And they expect that these promises are unconditional. And the fact is, as he says in chapter 5, I have put you in the midst of the nations, but you've become worse than the nations around you. You're to be a light to the world, my agents of grace and revelation. And they've betrayed that. And in fact, in chapter 16, you are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And he repeats that again in 23. So that their theology is orthodox, but their practice is all wrong. They prove themselves not to be the covenant people. The Davidic kings have proved themselves not to be what God asked, and they've desecrated the whole place. It's got to be cleaned out. And so when Nebuchadnezzar's armies come, they are shaking their fists in Yahweh's face and saying, you betrayed us. You didn't keep your promise. So that the exiles, Ezekiel's audience in Babylon, they are angry with God. The image in the vision in chapter 8, they say, Yahweh doesn't see, Yahweh has abandoned his land. And they're accusing Yahweh of being unfaithful to his covenant promises. And, you know, that colors every one of the oracles of judgment from chapter 4 all the way through to 24 addresses one or two of these pillars. And Ezekiel is knocking them down. But of course, as God already said through Moses in Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 4, 30, and 28. The judgment cannot be the last word. God does, in fact, not go back on his promise. But the judgment was part of the covenant document. When he had Nebuchadnezzar coming in, he was not going back on his word. They just hadn't been reading the fine print. In that covenant, it said, if you behave this way, this is what will happen. It's written there. And God would have betrayed the covenant had he not finally done it. But once it's done, God says, phew, I'm glad that's over. Ezekiel, your mouth is open. Now you can start to talk about anything you want. There's a whole new freedom. But of course, by then his wife is gone. Who's he going to talk to? And nobody's listening to him. And at the end of chapter 33, they're still not listening. But what happens is the shape of Ezekiel's oracles is completely transformed, so that whatever he was tearing down, those pillars he was knocking down, he is now reconstructing to create an image of Israel's restoration in the future. And that restoration has to involve renewal of the covenant. I will be your God again. It has to involve bringing them back to the land that was eternal. It has to involve putting David back on the throne. I will put over you one shepherd, my servant David. Chapter 34 and chapter 37. And God needs to return to his place. That all has to happen. So that in chapters 34 through 36, systematically, you have him fixing up the land, bringing the people, giving them a heart transplant so that they finally live according to the ideals of the old covenant. Deuteronomy 30 has this: I will circumcise their hearts and they will love me, demonstrate love and walk in my ways. And that's exactly what happens in chapter 36. He anticipates not merely circumcision of the heart, he is now a heart transplant. And actually, heart is also mind, so it's also a brain transplant, so that they are completely transformed from the inside out. This is not a self-reformation. It's not. Then you will loathe yourselves because you will realize, I didn't deserve this. How wicked we were. But the Lord, in his gracious sovereignty, I prefer that to sovereign grace. It's gracious sovereignty. In his gracious sovereignty, takes us back. He performs the surgery that needs to happen. He does all of this. And he brings us back home and he puts over us a David again. So that when they go back in 539, all of these promises are fulfilled in small measure. The Hebrew word is ma'at. In chapter 11, he says, I will be your dwelling for a little bit in exile, chapter 11 at the end, ma'at. What happens in 539 is the people are back. Oh, but it's only a handful, really. And they're largely Judeans and Levites. Where are the rest of the tribes? They're not here. Chapter 37 says it will be all the tribes. 539, a handful are back. They're in the land. Oh, but they're just in this little piece of land around Jerusalem. Where's the rest of Ezekiel's map? So it's a picture of the whole country coming together. David will be back. Oh, yeah, Zerubbabel. But who's Zerubbabel? He's not a king. He's a descendant of Jehoiakim, so he's a Davidite, but he's not king. So it's in part, but not complete. We're still waiting for the real deal. And then, of course, God has to return. And it's at this point that you get all the temple imagery at the end, the glory of the Lord. God needs to return, and the vocabulary Ezekiel uses to describe that magnificent restoration. He's a priest. He uses the vocabulary Ezekiel, the priest, is familiar with. So he paints it in terms of the temple is back. The interesting thing is, contrary to interpretations that I used to have and my father certainly had, this is not what happens in chapters 40 to 48 is not a mandate to build a new temple. Ezekiel is taking a tour in vision of a temple that already exists. God is back. The interesting thing is there are some aspects of the return that may disappoint. There's no Ark of the Covenant here. There is no high priest. Zadokites are back as a bunch, but there's no high priest. The glory comes back, and he enters the temple. But where does he dwell, actually? At the end of chapter 37, it's a very curious little statement that when I was writing the commentary, I didn't realize how significant. I will make a covenant of peace, and it will be everlasting. There it is. And I will place them and multiply them and set my sanctuary in the midst. My dwelling place will be with them, and I will be. My dwelling place will be with them. The Hebrew says over them. This is not accidental. In the final chapters, the glory is not boxed in the temple. The glory hovers over the temple, giving light to the whole land. And I think ultimately radiating finally to all the ends of the earth. It is using the vocabulary of the old temple, but it's magnificent transformation of something far greater. I've changed my mind also, and this will be reflected in the new commentary, on the location of the temple. I don't think it's on the very spot of Jerusalem. I think it's to the north. Everything is transformed. Jerusalem doesn't deserve it because of the way they desecrated it. But Zion moves. I don't think the book ever mentions Zion, does it? Zion theology. I don't think it's ever there. But Zion moves to a new place because it's a new beginning. There's too much baggage in Jerusalem. And this is also why Ezekiel never calls Israel's kings Melech, except once in 37, where it's not actually a slip, but people argue that the Septuagint has it right. It's Archon, it's ruler. But he calls Nebuchadnezzar a king, he calls other people kings, but Israel's kings he never dignifies with a name. It's transformed. The Messiah is my servant David, as my shepherd over all people. There's one reference to him as the returned person as the king in chapter 37. But other than that, but everything is transformed so that the mother lode, that's a geology language, the place where the ore of gold is most consecrated in that seam that they're mining, the mother lode of divine glory and holiness is now visible for all, and it sends its light to all. So in my interpretation, when my commentary came out from the evangelical perspective, my friends were not happy with me. Those in the Reformed tradition weren't happy with me because I view all of these promises to be eternal. And in my view, God's promise to Abraham and his physical descendants is irrevocable. But on the other hand, in my view, this is not a blueprint for a future construction. This is painting a future theological reality and geographic reality, but using the paint brushes and the paint colors that the prophet has. So that in my mind, this becomes a magnificent picture of transformed Israel, but Israel fulfilling its mission as a microcosm of the world. And it's an eschatological picture of reconstruction of the cosmos in a new world order. And in my view, Israel has to be a part of that. So the people in this country, we talk about the dispensationalist points of view. They don't like it that I don't see this as a physical plan for literal fulfillment. The principles will have to be fulfilled. God's promises are eternal. But this is a BC picture of an eschatological reality. That's how I interpret that.
Wow, incredible. So I want to ask many questions because in my place, many people believe and still wait for this restoration of third temple. So this is completely relevant, but yeah. So what about chapter 4? This is especially important for my tradition because Seventh-day Adventists wants to draw a day-year principle from this text. They say, "Oh, I give you day for a year." So yeah, can you comment that text and fulfillment because we have 390 days and 40 days. So where is that in the history? So
Oh, you have raised a problem text. And I have to say at the outset that there are half a dozen ways of doing this. None of them is perfect. None of them is clear. So anything I say, I haven't changed my mind since I wrote the commentary, but I still admit that my opinion is in soft lead pencil. And we can take these and plot these years as looking forward, or take them and plot them as looking backwards. And I actually think that it's a mix between the two. It makes the most sense to me when you see, lie down on your left side and lay the iniquity of the house on it, you shall bear their iniquity for the number of days that you lie on it. I've assigned you a number of days corresponding to the years of their iniquity, 390 days. And you shall bear their iniquity. 390 days. Well, if it's, let's see, what's the date of this? If it's 593, 593, and we're looking forwards, 390, what do we get? 30, about 200 BC. We're looking forwards. And something should happen at 200, about 200 BC. What will it
yeah,
be?
203, right? BC.
Yeah, 203. Yep.
Yeah, so I don't know what happened.
I don't know what I mean. We're now in the Hellenistic world, and it's a little too early for Antiochus Epiphanes yet. You know, those sorts of things that show up in Daniel. Here's what I do with it. I think he's talking here about Israel's past sins. And if instead of subtracting, we add them.
Yeah, that's 983, right?
That's 983. Well, where are we now?
David's
We're in
time,
the United
Solomon, right? Yeah.
Yes, we're in the United Monarchy. What happened in the United Monarchy? It's very interesting that when you read the two genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament, in Matthew, he has Jesus descended via Joseph, the legal line. He has him descended from Solomon, and then Solomon's sons, and so on. In Luke, presumably Mary's genealogy, he has him descended from Nathan. And then it skips all the kings of Israel until it comes back to Jehoiakim. What's the deal? Solomon doesn't even count, because Solomon is the beginning of the problem. And so, in my view, this is chapter 16, chapter 20 and 23, all these historical reconstructions. It is the history of Israel as a monarchy to the point of Ezekiel's time. And here, the iniquity, all the years, this is what makes the judgment necessary, this history of sin. But then what happens? When you've completed these, and I would say, and the judgment has happened, lie down a second time, but on your right side, bear the iniquity of the house of Judah. 40 days, a day for each year. Well, it's the same verb, isn't it? Nasa avon. It's the same expression. In the first 390 days, it means you are assuming responsibility for the sin that you have committed, Israel has committed. Now, he's using the same expression, but as he so often does in many of his oracles, he uses an expression in more than one way in any given context. In chapter 37, he uses the word ruach, spirit, wind, breath, in 4 different ways in 14 verses. 4 different, same word. Here, I think at this point, it means, remember the prophecy in Isaiah, comfort you, my people. They've borne the double portion of my sin. It's a wonderful good news. I think it's chapter 40 of Isaiah. Here, he is representing the period of Israel's being judged for their sin and their sin being carried. They've experienced the judgment. And you do the math. We're at 593. Well, what's 40 years? 543. No, 553. 93, yeah. We're getting close now to the end. And of course, 40 becomes a generational thing, doesn't it? The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years because that's how long it took to get rid of one generation and raise up another. This is what's happening here. This gives the Lord the opportunity to raise up a new generation. And there is hope in the end. And the message of hope here is that this period of judgment there's an end to it. It's not forever. And after that, when you can, then you set your, So that's how I that makes the most sense to me. There's still lots of holes in that one. But I think given Ezekiel's audience, given what comes after this in his oracles, it is an invitation to recognize what follows as a legal proceeding in which God raises the indictment and executes the judgment. When you get to the vision in chapter 8, where he sees all these evils being perpetrated in the temple for horrific things, this is, again, a legal proceeding presenting the evidence. Chapter 9 is the judgment. And again, the presentation of the evidence is proportionately a lot longer. And then the judgment is very, very short description. And then when you get to chapter 10, you have throwing of the burning coals over the city. That still looks like judgment, doesn't it? And in my commentary, I thought it was. I've changed my mind on that. John Goldingay has pointed out that sprinkling, that's the verb. Sprinkle the coals. That's always used, including in the book of Ezekiel. It's used of purifying something. So what's happening already in chapter 10, he sees the ultimate stage of the purification of Jerusalem as the preliminary to the restoration. So I wasn't aware of that when I wrote my commentary, and I should have noticed that, but he pointed it out rather beautifully in a Vetus Testamentum article, and it's now in his commentary as well. So,
wow, impressive. So, if I understood well, you want to say that this goes from a united monarchy toward Cyrus the Great, right? Or what happened in 553? Is that end of exile or what?
In 5.3. In 5.3, of course, there's where you have take a few a number, bind them in the edges of your robe. This is a beautiful thing, because he's cut his hair off and he's divided into three parts. One part he chops up. They die in battle, the sword. One part he burns, and one part he throws to the wind. But put a few of these hairs in the hem of your garment. And that's all he says. This is the first hint we have in the book, and it's uninterpreted. It's the first hint we have of hope. Later on in chapter 11, he will be explicit in telling the exiles, you are the future. Anybody who survives the judgment in Jerusalem is not part of God's future for this nation. But it's not, as we will find out there, it's not unconditional. You must have a change of heart, get yourself a new heart. That kind of expression he has. But this is the first of a half a dozen texts that punctuate oracles of judgment with hints of hope. You have it here, you have it in chapter 11, you have it in chapter 16 that ends with the renewal of the covenant after bringing back Jerusalem and her siblings. You have it in 21. Yeah, these are hints. Oh, of course, you have it in chapter 17, that oracle against Jehoiakim, that royal pillar, in chapter 12, where he has chapter 17. It ends with a brilliant one of taking this sprig off the cedar of Lebanon and planting it, and it grows into a massive tree. And of course, that's about the Davidic monarchy. Jehoiakim is that little twig. And God, in his gracious providence, Babylon functions as a safe. Do you know what a safe is? Where you store your treasures so that if your house burns, they're safe. He brings the people out of Babylon, including one member of the royal family. Why? He has made an eternal covenant with them. And if they would all be eliminated, he would have gone back on his word. But he brings them out, puts them in Babylon, and has, my interpretation, has Daniel supervised their allotment of territory, like Joseph did, and they gave them Goshen in Egypt. That was good land there. They flourished. And there they are preserved, so that after the judgment is over, we can start over again without having broken our promise. No covenant is broken, because these are the same people. This is the same lineage, and they will be back. So it is a brilliant word of hope at that point.
Right, Professor Block, thank you so much. I understand a little better now. So you want to say that those numbers shouldn't be taken strict mathematically, like exact 390, but right, like a round number, symbolical, or?
I think we can be too preoccupied with literalism in every little detail. But the moment you have a zero on the end, something is rounded up or rounded down. We need to be literary. We need always to be asking ourselves, what does the text say? What does the text mean? What does the text mean to me? But there's one other question in there. Why does it say it like that? And that's what we always need to be asking. Do you know about speech act theory? Have you done anything with speech act theory? Kevin Van
No,
Hooser has done a lot of good work.
Mm,
You have
I'm not aware.
three big words we use. One is locution. Those are the words we use when we say something. So that, an illustration, when I was teaching and I'm fumbling around and I want to make a note and I can't find my pen. So I ask a student, so I ask, do you have a pen? Well, those are the words I use. What does that mean? It's a merely academic question. Do you have a pen? Yeah, I've got 1, 2, 3. I got lots of pens. But you take it to mean, could I borrow your pen? That, or pen. What's a pen? Pig pen, chicken pen, whatever. The word itself is quite ambiguous, ambivalent. The locution, the words we use. Illocution, the meaning intended. And then the perlocution, that's the meaning we give to it. And often there's a gap between the illocution and the perlocution. The point of exegesis, study, hermeneutics is to get the perlocution as close to the illocution as we can. This applies to any text. So that in this case, the perlocution, the locution is exact numbers. Well, to the 10th, 390, 3 times 13, whatever that is, and 40. Well, 40 is common. So the locution is these numbers. The illocution that's the riddle, isn't it? Ezekiel talks in riddles. His sign acts are riddles. And when he digs a hole in the wall of his house and crawls out with a knapsack on his back, if you were an exile, how would you interpret that? I have a feeling, without interpretation, you could go many ways. What's the point? They could be saying, we are stuck here in exile. We're soon going to be out of here, packing our bags and going home. That's what they were looking forward to. God won't let Jerusalem fall. We're not going to be this in Jeremiah. Jeremiah tells them to plant gardens and pray for the peace of your hosts or whatever else. And the false prophets are saying, no, you're going home soon. No. What this is, it turns out to be, David is the king. He's coming out of his city, and he's going to be captured and schlepped off into exile. And that's Zedekiah. His fate is horrible. And so, the locution is a man digging a hole in the wall. That's a stupid thing to do. He's nuts. It's mud brick. He digs a hole. He comes out with a knapsack on his back. Well, what does this mean? I'm sure Ezekiel probably went home after doing that without interpreting. And then he came back. No, he probably did interpret it right off the bat. But if he hadn't given them an interpretation, he would have left it up to them. You make of it what you want. This is reader response hermeneutic. The reader does not determine meaning. It's up to the reader to get as close to the meaning of the author's intention as he can. And so we'll never get it perfect, and that's why I say mine's in pencil. It's not part of the scripture. He doesn't give us an interpretation. Elsewhere he does. Here he doesn't. So anyhow, this applies to lots of things, doesn't it?
Okay, thanks for another lesson. I appreciate. But do you think if we add those two numbers, it gives us 430? Is it like a reference to Abraham, to Moses? That's in Genesis, that number maybe or not? I don't know.
Yes, I mean, you'll be 430 years in exile, and then I'll bring you back. In total, that may be. I hadn't even thought about that. Maybe there is a connection there. I don't know.
And also, would you see a reference in Numbers 14, because it says, I give you a year for a day because you spied that land,
yes,
and 40 years for 40 days. So we see also here like that expression, right?
Yes, there are precedents for these sorts of things. And I'm grateful that you added them up and you saw a corresponding reference. Usually it's in terms of 400 years they were in Egypt in slavery, but there is one place where it is 430, which is exactly the number we have here. Maybe so. Maybe
yeah.
So. Yes, because, but we have to be careful. Israel's reason for being in Egypt was not their sin. They were not sent to Egypt as punishment for wickedness. Joseph is in Egypt because of the Israelites, his brother's sin, but not his. So we always have to be careful. The return from exile from Babylon is often described in terms of a new exodus coming out of Egypt. This will make that coming out of Egypt look like kindergarten. But we have to be careful there. Yes, they went to Babylon as captives, but very quickly they were liberated. They were quite free. If you read the book of Ezekiel, people are going about doing their business. It's a community functioning as if it's normal. So that they're not enslaved. It was humbling to be taken there, and we want to be back home, but they are not, and they are there because of their sin. But very quickly that changes. The Egyptian experience was the opposite. They went there with God's calling as innocent. They were enslaved only at the end. It was not 400 years of slavery. It was 400 years of building the population. And so at the end, they were victims of somebody else's sin. That is the Pharaoh. Joseph was there as a victim of his brother's sin, but they were, at the end, they left to escape the captivity and the slavery of the hosts. In Babylon, it's the reverse. They come as captives and are immediately liberated economically and socio-politically. And then their captors sponsor their return home. It's quite a different picture in those respects. But yes, exile and return, exile and return. The reasons for exile are different, and the circumstances of the return are different too. So.
Yes, right. So, just the last question about this vision. I wonder, what do you think about Adventist scholars who would like to see this as a key when you see another prophecy like in Daniel and even Revelation in New Testament? So they like to use this principle like a day for a year. So when you see, for example, prophecy that speaks about I don't know 1,260 days. So this is actual years. So what do you think about all this? I just wonder.
Well, I think what we need to realize is that, especially in Revelation, in Revelation, the hermeneutic is the same. They're using numbers, but numbers may have a different significance than their literal meaning. And the point of 1,000 years, I mean, is that a literal 1,000 years that predates the eschatological renewal? In my background, we always said absolutely yes. But in where I am now, I think at that point, 1,000 years means a long time. And it may not necessarily be a separate period. Could it be overlapping or whatever? So that in my mind, millennial images and the ultimate cosmic renewal images, the boundaries blur. And I don't spend a lot of time trying to make what's fuzzy in the text crisp. So anyhow, I have other things to do too. So yes, we need always to ask what is the significance of the numbers, and sometimes the very detail. I mean, you do the numbers of the people who came out of Egypt. Again, this is a contrast to the exile. The point of the return from Egypt is that all Israel came back, and it's a big bunch. In Ezekiel's context, all Israel didn't come back. Yes, it was thousands, but it wasn't everybody, so there's a difference. But yeah, we need always to wrestle with significance and meaning to an original audience is what we push for, but then its significance for how it's a method, a detail is picked up later that we don't know until we cut to the later texts. It's a part of reception history. Yes.
Very good. Good advice. Thank you so much. So there is almost a consensus, I think, among scholars that say that God gave bad laws in Ezekiel 20, 25 to 26. So this is, really hard question for us because it seems like God gave laws to people to sacrifice their children, and that's
Well,
terrifying.
this is another
Terrible.
one of those cases where whatever answer we give, there are problems. And so there are a couple of signals here that I think provide a clue. One of which is, and now I want to get it straight. If we go to Ezekiel 20, 25, I want to get it straight. What I noticed as I was working on this a long time ago in another millennium, when it comes to 25, and I will give to them chukim lo tovim, ordinances that are not good, umishpatim lo yechyu bahem, and stipulations, judgments. It's not judicial punishment, but it is divine judgments about the vassal's conduct. So I call it stipulations that do not yield life, or by which they do not live. Now, if you look, the locution is absolutely contradictory to Moses. In Deuteronomy, it's regularly, by which you live. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse, it's in about 22, 23. After telling the story, what's the point of all these laws? He gives a story of God's miraculous bringing them out of Egypt. And then I gave you the commands for your good and for your life, Yehu. And it's actually the Piel, to sustain your life. And here he says, there are laws that are not good and that don't yield life. So on the face of it, based on Moses' statement in chapter 13, anybody who preaches a gospel that contradicts what I'm saying needs to be stoned. And this looks like that's what he's doing. But there is, right in the wording, though, one clue that there may be a twinkle in his eye or a wink as he's saying this. And that is the form of his word for ordinances, chukim, masculine plural. This word can be either feminine or masculine. In the rest of the chapter, whenever Ezekiel uses it of the ordinances associated with a covenant, it's always chukoth, feminine, plural. He breaks his pattern here, which may be a slight clue to where we go with this. He's inviting people, don't take this in its normal sense, which then suggests that there's a different category of ordinances. Or is it ordinances? These are simply decrees, statutes, a judgment. And in this case, in the most recent work, I don't know if it's the most recent anymore, but in a recent work of Calvin Freeble and my student Jason Guile have also worked on this. In this instance, he is actually saying, I gave them a decree of judgment by which they died or will die. And that's what's happening. This is still in the first 24 chapters of Ezekiel. He is alluding here not to the covenant stipulations, but to a particular set of declarations by God on that the ordinance could be, I've called Nebuchadnezzar. He's coming. This will not mean life for you. It will mean death. And for your own experience, it will not be good. It will be awful. It's ra'ah. So in my understanding, that's the best way of going. Of course, there are some, my good friend who's no longer with us, John Sailhamer. In his glasses, this was the lens through which he looked at all the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law was intentionally given to kill, so that, in absolute contrast to Jacob Milgrom, a Jewish scholar, where in the Pentateuch, Sinai is the high point of the narrative. In Sailhamer's view, Sinai was the low point. The Lord's when the Lord appeared, the people stood. He interprets that as stopped. Instead of going up to the mountain, they stopped and they rejected him. I can't go there. I think they stood. Amad, it can mean stop in some context, but here they stood because you never sit in the presence of a superior. The Lord has just shown up. The king has come. And when the king comes, you all stand. They stood. So I think that's the absolutely appropriate response. It was not resistance to what God's overture. It was actually the appropriate response to God's overture. So, but in his lens, I mean, in dispensationalist circles, there's a very negative view of laws which kill. And of course, that's what I'm fighting in this essay on Deuteronomy I'm writing. No, the laws are there to sustain life. It's not a way of salvation. It's the way the saved live. It's the way of saying thank you to the salvation we've already received. It's always past tense. I am Yahweh, who will bring you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, if you have no other gods, if you keep the Sabbath and all the rest of it. No, it's not that way. He didn't give the laws to them in Egypt as the precondition for salvation, rescue. No, he gave them after he rescued them as the response to their rescue. And so that's, I think, how we need to look at this. In this case, I think it has to do with new decrees of God concerning Israel's fate in the present moment. And it's a different way of using the word. But Ezekiel does this sort of thing. So that's what I do with it.
Really good. So you even see offering firstborns as we see in the next verse, because it's referring to Molech cult, right?
And I pronounce them unclean because of the gifts that they caused their firstborn to pass through the fire. I mean, it doesn't say he commanded them to give these offerings, but I think the decree here is pronouncing the judgment for having done that. I pronounce them unclean because of their gifts. I gave them statutes that were not good in response to their uncleanness. So I think that is probably the best way to take the relationship. Yeah.
Yes, I understand. Okay, so Dr. Block, we are almost out of time because it's 2 hours, I think. So can you just give us conclusion? Where do you see the gospel or anything beautiful in this book of Ezekiel? Can you give us any final word?
Well, I do know of some people who say in Ezekiel there is no gospel. In my mind, just because a word isn't used doesn't mean the concept isn't there. Words for grace and words for mercy are in short supply in this book. But there's brilliant gospel in the first part of chapter 16, that difficult chapter. He came across this foundling out there and he said, in your blood, live, live, live. That's grace. And then he came back, sometime later, she had reached the age of sexual maturity. And again, she was naked, but now she's vulnerable for a different reason, because when you're a poor infant, the vultures are going to come and eat you. Well, this time you're opening yourself up to other vultures, human men. And what does God do? He rescues her. And not only does he rescue her the second time, he marries her. He treats her like his queen. Grace. This is a picture of our lot as human beings. We're all Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother was a Hittite. Apart from God's grace, we're all that. Now the question, most of the rest of the chapter is, what do you do with the grace that you've experienced? And so it's a dark picture of how people respond. And when when his people betray him after his grace, in light of his grace, he is rightfully angry. But the good news at the end of chapter 16 is he restores his covenant with them. It ends on that positive note. The judgment isn't the end. So that is grace. Every hint of a future after judgment is grace. When you get to chapter 36, of course, they are not deserving of a heart transplant. They are foul. God in his grace removes them from the land, cleanses the land, and prepares it for their return. And then, without any hint of Israel deserving it, he puts them to sleep, takes out the stone heart, puts in a new heart, and they walk. And they remember their sin. How could he do this to us, given how we have responded to him? That's the recognition of grace. So that all the restoration texts reflect gospel. God is committed to his people. God is true to his promises. God's future for his people is great and glorious, and God delights us in his presence. He delights having us in his presence. If that ain't gospel, I don't know where gospel is. So, no, there's lots of grace, lots of judgment first, but God in his mercy. We've had the Gaza war there, going on there for so long. When the Israelis would come over with their bombs over Gaza, they would regularly send them notices, we're coming. That's grace. You don't have to get hit. You can avoid it. That's grace. And that's the kind of scene we've got here. He sent the fact that Ezekiel is there. He didn't deserve this calling either. He was as hard as the rest of them. Don't be like your countrymen. He keeps warning him. That Ezekiel was present in their midst was a tremendous bolt of grace into a very dark world. So you have to work a little harder at finding grace in every message. But one of the messages has to be, knowing I'm a sinner is good news. That I'm a sinner is not good news. But knowing I am a sinner is good news. Knowing there's a God up there who holds me accountable, all accountable, who operates with justice and righteousness, that's good news. And knowing that he has a future for us, who walk with him and trust him, that's grace. So.
Dear Professor Block, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed. And as we bring this conversation to a close, it's clear that the book of Ezekiel resists easy answers. So, Dr. Block, thank you for helping us to read this book with historical rigor, theological sensitivity, and intellectual honesty. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the NT Podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment. Until next time, keep reading carefully, thinking deeply, and asking better questions of the text. Bye-bye.